Hey there, Michael with the Reason RX podcast. Hope you are doing all right and handling this COVID thing okay. Hope you're getting out, getting some sunshine, exercise, vitamin D, good sleep. Got some stuff I'd recommend people look into if you haven't already. See what our immune system needs, what we need to be healthy. Um, the thing behind, when there's a disease, there's both the vector and the host. I think we need to focus more on taking care of the host and not being scared or trying to fight the vector. Of course, we do that, obviously, but we should focus more on making the host stronger. That should be in our culture. What does the immune system need? What does the whole person need to support the immune system? Sleep, vitamin D, cofactors of vitamin D like vitamin A, vitamin K, zinc, magnesium, and all that. Exercise, fresh air, good breathing, fitness, and so on. Dietary factors. The immune system is chemical. It needs certain chemicals for it to work. Cofactors and all that. So hopefully we do that. Get more people looking into that. I'm digging into that, so we'll be better off. But today, I want to talk a little bit more about logic. Did that like February 1st, 2019. Talked a bit about some basics of what logic is, why it's important, how it's a tool of survival, a little bit about Aristotle and Abraham Lincoln, some things that make up logic. So I'll review some of that, do a little bit more today. But very important subject, something every teacher should know, every adult, actually. We should be clear about what logic is, on the alert for some misconceptions about it, some false ideas about logic. So, a lot of times when we think about logic, people think about deduction or argument, and yes, absolutely, but that's only part of it. There's so much more that's important. If we just do deduction, then we are like chained to thoughts or someone else's thoughts. Could be ill-formed thoughts. Deduction can work no better than the inductions and concepts that we formed, So, deduction and induction. Let's kind of go over that. That's something I hear a lot of confusion on. People think they hear Sherlock Holmes is about deduction, and they read some stuff and they think, but isn't what he's doing induction? I've heard some really smart people in some podcasts talk about that. Some confusion, lack of understanding what's going on, what it is. So that can be a place to start, get some of this stuff down, see what's going on. So, deduction and induction. Now, induction is the cognitive process of forming a generalization. We start with concrete things and a cognitive context and form a generalization from that. Something necessitated by the context that we have. The concepts and context and identifications. So, all lightning is electricity. That's a generalization. That's something that people had to learn in history. Lightning's not merely an electrical-like thing, not something like electricity, but it is electricity. Or, all electricity and magnetism are different aspects of the same underlying phenomenon. That was only a more recent discovery in physics, and hence we have electromagnetism instead of two separate diverse fields of one electricity and one magnetism. They've been unified following the Greek program of looking for the one in the many, the essential, the underlying relationship. Or all planets orbit the sun in elliptical orbits with the sun at one focus. A generalization. All humans are mortal. All dogs bark, within a context, of course. We learned there that it's got to be that, oh, whoa, like dogs, their vocal system can go out or something like that. They can be hurt or whatever. So, with a certain context, as long as there's nothing unusual going on, dogs bark. So there's some generalizations, things like that. Deduction is using those. It's getting a generalization and applying it to a new concrete. So induction, we have certain concrete things. This flash of light in the sky, this other flash of light, and we compare that to sparks in the science of electricity that was known at Franklin's time, and see that all lightning is electricity. There's this identification there. In all times, in all places, lightning is electricity. And in all times, in all places, all humans are mortal. That's a complex, interesting induction. Could talk about sometime, a lot to it. So we got to have certain concrete things like people, and a context about things being finite, people, animals, plants, inanimate things. In this context, we can figure out that all humans are mortal. Or when we're young, we learn that in a context, within certain restrictions given, for certain givens, all waiters or waitresses take orders of food and bring food to your table. Of course, sometimes the tasks are divided up a little differently. Someone might take the order, someone might bring the order, someone else. But a lot of times what we learn is that there's this person who comes to the table, takes the order at certain places, not at grocery stores, not at gas stations usually, but at certain places, certain businesses, certain buildings. They do that while everyone's sitting around, and then food's brought from somewhere. So we learn that generalization. Or we learn that forks are objects of a certain shape that can be used to stab into food and put it in our mouth. And then when we go to some place, once we got the generalization about waiters or waitresses, when we go to a restaurant, when we're a kid, when we're first learning this, we know that, hey, there's that person that's going to take our order and bring our food. And we know what's going on, and we apply that identification in that context to that person. Or we don't sit down at a table and freak out. What the hell is this thing in front of me? Is it going to attack me? What is it? Is it a gun? Is it a rock? Is it a criminal? No, this thing sitting in front of you is a metal object that's inanimate that eventually you're going to be using to stick into your food and put the food in your mouth. All forks, blah, blah, blah. So it'd be a deduction there. We're applying a generalization to a new thing, to a new specific concrete fork that we've never seen before, or knife, or whatever. Or a generalization about waiters and waitresses to this person we've never seen before and may never see again. So deduction is using a generalization, applying it to a concrete. Induction is getting a generalization from some concretes in a context. A lot more complicated than deduction, and that's why induction has only recently been started to be understood, and still we got a long way to go. There is no full comprehensive theory of induction yet. Deduction, that's been known for a long time. Aristotle figured that out. It took a genius like him who figured out what logic was. But deduction's been developed more since then. So there's a difference, induction versus deduction. So with Sherlock Holmes, notice he had to do induction before he ever did any of his cases. In one of the first stories written about him, Arthur Conan Doyle has, talks about some monographs that Sherlock wrote. So Sherlock had to look at cigarettes and cigars to study the ashes, to see ashes of this kind come from this kind of cigar or cigarette. Ashes of this kind come from this kind of cigar or cigarette. So, it might be like ashes of a certain texture, chemical makeup, color, all that are Camel cigarettes, filterless or whatever. And ashes of a certain type, color, texture are a certain type of cigar. And so he'd get all this down. And then when he saw these ashes, he had his generalization. And so he could apply that generalization to these ashes. And he would use deduction. All ashes of a certain type come from the cigarette. These ashes are from a certain type. Therefore, they come from a certain cigarette. Things like that. Or he would know about the soil in different parts of the city. And he can make generalizations. All soil in this part of the city is maybe red and clayey or whatever. Also here is like black and loamy. And so if he found some soil on someone's shoe, he could deduce where they came from. But he had to do the generalizations in the first place. He had to connect in reality, make these causal connections, generalize. Then he could deduce. So notice deduction is parasitic on induction. No induction, no deduction is possible. And of course, we're using ideas and concepts when we have sentences, propositions, thoughts. To know something about soil of a certain kind comes from a certain area, you got to have the concept of soil. And then with what he's doing, you got to have the concept of shoe. You got to have the concept of city and the concept of parts of a city. Or concept of cigarette, concept of cigar, or when he's classifying people, he needs concept of hat, concept of economic status, other concepts. And so you can see that if someone has a expensive hat, but it's not well taken care of, he can deduce that they had good means, but they've lost maybe a job, and so they're on hard times after having been of good means. Takes concepts. So deduction's parasitic on that also. So some of that stuff's more important. Deduction's important to know because clearly it comes up a lot in life. We're applying generalizations to all kinds of things all over the place automatically once we learn things. And then an argument, we need to know how to go through a good step-by-step argument. Logic is important there also. But that's getting on a little bit. So deduction and induction. We went over the difference between those two. Hopefully that's clear. It's clear how Sherlock Holmes is using deduction in a lot of what he did. Just because an observation is involved, doesn't mean it's induction. Sherlock Holmes is using observation and applying generalizations to what he observes. So he's using deduction because he's already formed the generalizations. He's going around a room, being very observant, identifying all these different things about the room or whatever. Features, unusual features, suggestive features, and then applying generalizations to them. So it's deduction. And the things he's learned before the case were induction. Of course, we can learn. You can learn some things as he's going along, forming some inductions, but what he's doing a lot is deduction. So in concept formation, as with induction, it's similar. You got to have certain, like a variety of concrete things in a context to form a concept, kind of classifying things, saying that they're related. Concept of dog, concept of planet. We can't have a generalization of all planets orbit the sun in elliptical orbits with the sun at one focus unless we know planet, orbit, ellipse, sun, focus, some things like that. We got to have those individual concepts first. As I said, with like cigarette, cigar, ash, soil, red, hat, economic status. We got to have some concepts there that we formed. And then we can use them. So induction, concept formation. You have certain concrete things in a context, and we can generalize to get induction. We can form a concept relating certain things. And then deduction uses our inductions. So again, Sherlock Holmes had to be inductive to some extent, but in his cases, he's using stuff he already knew, he already figured out, did some science on, did experiments on, so a lot of it's deduction. So deduction, important, a lot to it. Aristotle developed it a lot, something to study. It's also important to study geometry, as we talked about. Abraham Lincoln learned how to reason and think better by memorizing Euclid's elements to make himself a better thinker. And that's discussed in a book I've started reading. Read it now and then when I get a chance. Abraham Lincoln and the Structure of Reason. I'll try to put a link in the show notes about that. It's got some interesting stuff in it. Abraham Lincoln, over like from the 50s and when he was in his 40s, in like early 1850s until sometime before 1860. I don't know the exact dates, but he spent a few years or several years, 3 to 7, studying and memorizing Euclid's elements. He did it deliberately as a program to make himself a better thinker. He was already known for being a good thinker, being sharp, but he was even better after this. I think he was kind of struggling, not winning some debates against Stephen Douglas, not doing so good in politics. He wanted to be better. As we know, he was smart. He was wise. He was a lawyer in his 40s, known as a good thinker. So of all the things he could do to make himself more successful, you know, go to Harvard and study law, go to Harvard and study something. If he needs more money, become a bank robber, train robber, something like that. Take up surveying on the side. Did he do any of that? No. The one thing he did to make himself a better reasoner, better at law, better talking, better convincing people of what the truth is and make sure he knows what the truth is in the first place himself, writing better. The one thing he did was to memorize Euclid's elements, to learn how you go from given information to a conclusion. He wanted to know what it meant to demonstrate. This is even recorded in historical writings, and it's in the book I mentioned, Abraham Lincoln and the Structure of Reason. He looked up demonstrate in the dictionary, and he says, okay, but that doesn't tell me what does it mean to demonstrate? No one could tell him, and he figured out the one place where he learned would be in geometry, in Euclid's elements, in proof in particular. So he studied it, memorized it, spent a long time memorizing all the proofs. So from what I heard, you could ask him any proof anywhere in Euclid's elements, and he could rattle it off right there. That's how well he knew it. Because remember, this was a diligent, disciplined study that he engaged in to be a better reasoner. And that takes training. And he did it on his own in his 40s. Something I recommend. I think we'd all be better off if more people did that. I mean, look what Lincoln did. Wrote some of the greatest political speeches in American history. Was an insightful thinker. Successful in what he did. Changed our country for the better. So that's important too in logic, and that's where people can get better at it. Now, as we said, deduction and induction. I mean, deduction versus induction. Deduction is parasitic on induction. Without generalizations, we can't apply them. Without concepts, we can't have inductions, and we can't apply generalizations. So, as a fundamental, we need to know how to form generalizations and how to form concepts. What's the logic? When do we do it right and when do we do it wrong? That's some of the more important stuff in logic. I won't be talking about that so much today, but that's some in the future. Helps us see more what logic is, because a lot of times people think about that symbolic logic silliness, which is useless for most stuff. Symbolic logic can be good for someone doing computer programming or for some limited things, but in general, totally useless. We need things that put us in touch with reality, like induction, concept formation, classification, definition. Those are much more important for everyone in thinking than this silly symbolic logic stuff, which is useless for most people. In logic, to make sure we're doing our deductions right and all that, getting argument right, going through a long sequence of steps like proving a case to a jury, as Lincoln did, we need to be in touch with reality. We need to not be lost in ideas. If all you have is deduction, you're lost in ideas. You're out of touch with the real world. And that's not what logic is about. It's not just playing with ideas. Logic, we'll get to more of that later, but logic includes, as I said, concept formation, induction, classification, definition, explanation. Then you can get into the logic of science, the logic of theory formation, some aspects of epistemology and logic, some important things about reason are the hierarchy of it, the fact that it's contextual, the fact that it involves integration, connecting things into one whole unit. It's like the one and the many. We're integrating or connecting into one when we identify that electricity and magnetism are different versions, different aspects of the same underlying phenomenon. Or integration is important when people connected math to physics. That was an advance. Or Newton did a great synthesis, a great integration of motion and physics on Earth with motion and physics in the heavens. He's identified that they are the same. They're not two separate realms with different physics. It's the same. That was a great integration or synthesis. And then in epistemology, we look at concepts versus percepts. Epistemology, the broader part of philosophy in which logic is studied. But what we want to do here, what I want to do is look at how do we get a valid concept of logic, so we can be clear on what we're talking about. As I said, there's a lot of misconceptions about what logic is. And part of that comes from not grasping and not teaching where we get the concept, what it means. Some people come at it like in midstream, all of a sudden out of nowhere. Hey, logic. And as I say, there's misconceptions. Some misconceptions from bad philosophies about what logic is. Plato, Immanuel Kant, John Dewey, Karl Popper, John Dewey, some others, Descartes. Other people are very wrong about what logic is. So if we look at how we get the concept, it'll clear some of that up. Because some people, they want to say logic is just about connecting ideas, but like on what basis? Like how the hell do we connect ideas if we're not relating them to reality? Like even I think Einstein fell for some of the simplicity and beauty nonsense. It's like scientific theory should be simple or beautiful. It's like, what the hell does it even mean? Beautiful, like how the hell do we tell if ideas are beautiful? And besides, beautiful and ugly, that depends on the person. Different people have different perspectives on that. It's all subjective. And in regard to simple or complex, I don't really care as long as it's true. You need efficiency in your thinking in so far as methodology to be able to live well. But reason takes care of some of that. That's what concepts and integration do. There's not some separate, simple thing. It's not metaphysical. It's more epistemological in our method of knowing things in reason, conceptually. So, and some things like quantum mechanics is not simple. Can't be. It is what it is. We need the concepts and knowledge to know something's true, regardless of how simple it is or not. Or, if like simplicity mattered, we might want circles instead of ellipses. But I don't really care about simplicity. I care about reality and truth. We got to bow down to that. So some stuff like that is just nonsense. There's no basis for them on their own detached from reality. Like, you separate yourself from reality, and then what does it mean to be simple? What does it mean to be beautiful? People are just lost in their own head, and then anything goes. But we want to see what logic is about. We can look at a couple things. We want to see, where does the concept logic come from? Why do we need it? And to do that, we should look at how we derived the concept, how Aristotle got it. So, if we think about some steps we need to, if we look back, where the hell did I get the concept of logic? Or where should I have gotten it if I got it correctly? What steps would I need to go through to get it correctly? Or when someone really knows what logic is, what did they do through their development? What steps did they take step by step, like a geometric proof, starting from the given and going through what's needed, no more and no less, to reach the conclusion? So, if we think about where we all started, we don't just have logic here, now, out of nowhere. It doesn't just magically appear midstream. Logic in the concept, when we get the concept, where did it come from? So we've got to start out, every one of us started off as babies. We had just experienced the evidence of the senses. We learned to identify things, ball, mom, dad, baby food, chair, all this stuff. We did it perceptually, non-conceptually. We were doing that at first. First, we had to have our experience. That had to develop. We had to get a sufficient context and develop sufficiently neurologically, and then we could learn our first words. Of course, we don't have to know about the neurology or the context. We don't. Not possible. We're just sensing and perceiving things. And then we learn our first words. Mom, dad, dog, milk, whatever. That comes about. We're learning some things. Then we learn language and sentences. So we're getting these concepts. So we're starting to conceptualize stuff first, mom, dad, dog. And then we learn language. Then we're learning some thoughts, propositions, not just concepts. And so we can start to learn some verbs too. Something we might say first is like, want, and then we just point to something. We can't say a full sentence. Maybe you're hungry, we're hungry and we want some food, and we just point to it and look at mom or dad and say, want. But if we were older and had more complex vocabulary in our little baby body, we'd be saying, Mom, I'm really hungry and I would really like that milk. I'm weak and don't know how to work my way through this world right now. All I can do is sit in this chair where you put me. I could not possibly get down from this chair on my own and get up on the cabinet and get that milk, but you are good in this world. You can move around. I've seen how competent you are. You can do lots of stuff I can't, and I know you love me. So, will you please get that milk for me? But they can't say that. All we can say is, want. So we do things like that. Or go, let's go. And then we can start to put concepts together into more complex ways. We can start to combine them and make thoughts, sentences. So we've got experience, we learn some first words, then we can start to learn our first sentences and talk. And all these generalizations are happening kind of effortlessly. Later on, it takes more effort to do some stuff, form the concept of government. But, at the beginning, dogs bark, dogs run around on four legs, things like that. It's more or less more closely automatic. It doesn't take so much cognitive, mental effort that some other abstractions do when we get older about logic, epistemology, the planets, the nature of science. Making some generalizations about those things is very different. But we learn language, we start talking, and then, and only then, can we learn that some people can be wrong, people can err, people can make believe, people can lie. That is something we learn after we have language as we're growing up. We're getting these concepts of liar, mistake, wrong, error. We're forming these generalizations. All people can lie. All people can be wrong. We get these specific contexts where it happens, and we're starting to generalize kind of automatically, without much conscious effort, versus when we're doing algebra or a geometric proof. It's the one that's more complicated. But we got to have this stuff, because here we're learning that we're not automatically right. We've been able to see things. You taste your food, it's good or bad. You see a dog, you see it bark, you feel the rain, all these other things when you're younger. And now we're learning to see that, whoa, there's something in us that's not automatically right. Someone says we are a certain way, and we know that's false, and we know they're wrong. Or, you can pretend you're different characters and play like Superman or Superwoman or whatever. We can play that, or make believe you're certain characters, put on a story, watch a movie, it's not real. Things like that can happen. So not everything we say is true or real. And we learn we can lie. We observe that in this new situation. It's like, whoa, it's like, here I am, and I know what happened. I know what my friend and I just did. And here my friend is saying that to his mom that we didn't do it. So we're learning that someone can state something that's deliberately diverges from the truth. It's not an accident, it's deliberate. Then we get the concept of lie. It's a deliberate attempt to mislead, to not tell the truth. It's not a mistake. Like, oh, from far away, I thought you were my friend John, but here, clearly, I see you're not. That's not a lie, that's just a mistake. We learn the difference. A lie is a deliberate departure from the truth, but one can be wrong where it's not deliberate. And we learn these things. We learn that, a lot of times what we say is true, or sometimes your parents might say, if you're good, we'll go to the store and we'll get you some ice cream or whatever, and then you never go, right? So you learn that, hey, someone can tell a lie, or you see that, you observe on your own that you sometimes lie to your parents. You lie to an elder because you're scared. You don't know any other way out of it. You do something wrong or that you shouldn't. You just don't want to handle the consequences because you're too young. It's just overwhelming psychologically. And so you try to say something else to get away from it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But it's a lie. So there we're learning something about thought. It can depart from the world. And this is an important stage in learning about logic. So we learn a basic thing here, that something's true when it corresponds to reality. There's a lot more to logic than that. Some people stop only there, but that's only part of it. It's an important thing, very, very important. This had to come up in the history of science. Thales was instrumental in doing some of this, looking in the right place. But it's something we got to learn on our own. We learn that there's got to be some real thing, some concrete thing. Even if we don't identify it in that way, we all know it's got to be real to be true. And then sometimes we learn that, in the next stage, okay, we've come to see that thoughts can be with reality or not. And they can not be in different ways. And then we learn that some ideas depend on certain others. We know to some extent, people don't generalize it to all human knowledge, but a lot of people have the concretes and context where they could and should if they put in the mental effort. Not that it's obvious, because it took a long time in history. A lot of great minds did not get it either. So don't make it seem, I don't want it to seem like it's all obvious and everyone should get it. And if you don't, you're not smart, because that's not true. I sure the hell didn't get it until people pointed it out to me, and I had to study logic. As I say, a lot of great minds in the history of thought didn't get it. It took a while. I sure the heck wouldn't have got the stuff that I know now all on my own. No way in heck. But we see that some ideas depend on others to a certain extent, like Algebra 2 depends on Algebra 1. You can't learn things in later grades until you got the earlier grades down. You learn some things about sometimes when you're studying grammar, you might not get all of it. There's some stuff that's more complicated you don't get. Or, if someone's teaching you, they might say, okay, we got to back up. I see that to get this concept in quadratic equations that you don't get, we got to go back to studying factoring. And we got to go back to studying the distributive property. So we got to take it back sometimes to understand things. Or maybe in physics, oh, you don't get this thing in work. Okay, yeah, it's because you're not getting the concept of force. Let's go back and revisit force. different things like that. And you know how in piano, violin, martial arts, chess, there's more complex stages that come later, but you got to get the beginning stuff first. Some skills and ideas depend on other prior basic ones. We can see that. So we get it with certain ideas, but certain skills also. Some skills depend upon other basic skills. Or physical education. You got to crawl before you walk, before you run. You can't run until you can walk. You can't walk until you can crawl. For most people. And you can't do martial arts until you can walk and got some balance. And you got to work on those. So some ideas, some skills. And then I think one thing that really starts to wire home things for most people are algebra and geometry. Where in algebra and geometry, we go through something that we don't really do in other subjects. We could, but we don't, just because of philosophy of education, nature of our culture, or some things like that. It'd be better off if we did, but we don't. But in algebra and geometry, we learn that we got to go through certain steps to get an answer. We have to go through certain steps in a certain order, doing no more and no less what we need to get the answer. We learn methods for doing long division. There are certain steps we got to do to get the truth, to get the right answer. We learn methods in calculus for finding an area. There are certain steps we have to go through to get the correct area. Or if we want to get the volume of some complex figure, we have the shell method. There are certain steps we need to go through to get the volume of some complex figure in 3 dimensions. And when we look at it, we see there's this whole chain of reasoning behind it, all these concepts we had to learn to get there. In geometric proofs, we learn that there's a starting place, just as there is in some algebra, and we go through certain steps to reach a conclusion. Okay, let's prove these triangles are congruent. Okay, let's prove these 2 arcs in this circle are the same measure. Things like that. We start with certain things like maybe in geometry with triangles, 2 sides of one triangle congruent to 2 sides of another, an angle congruent to an angle, and then we can prove the triangles are congruent. We've got to list the stuff down, go through certain steps, and if we don't put everything down, we don't get it right on the test, because it's like presenting something to a jury. That's what a geometric proof is like. We need to give the jury all the evidence they need in a good, efficient, intelligible order, not a mishmash, but a good order so they know what the truth is. You got to introduce evidence, start with a given, reason from that, introduce more evidence, put the stuff together, the old and new evidence, reason from that, and so on. Here's what to say about this person and why. That's the kind of thing we're starting to learn in algebra and geometry. But then what we need to do is generalize that to all thinking. A lot of people learn algebra and geometry, but never generalize to all human thinking. The fact that we have a starting point where we got to go through certain steps to reach a correct answer. And therefore, they're not getting some like what logic really is. But we got to identify that, as I say, we have to go through certain steps to be correct. So logic is not merely what we learn early when we learn that people can be wrong or lie, that you have to be identifying something real. Yes, that's part of it. But human reason is much more complex than that. It's not just looking. some stuff is more complicated and advanced and sophisticated and abstract. It's not all just like perceptually looking and there's a dog. It's barking. We need to have methods that take abstract, sophisticated generalizations and thoughts step by step back to reality. So you have to identify something real, but you got to have this step-by-step logical process that goes back calculus to pre-calculus to algebra 2 to algebra 1 to arithmetic to objects of the senses, experience. Then we're being logical. So logic is about identifying something real, but it's also about method, technique, correctly forming a concept, correctly forming a generalization, because we could be right or wrong on multi-levels, not just as a passive on-off mirror thing. It's there, it's not. Sometimes you might learn, like in algebra, you might make a few mistakes and end up getting the ostensibly correct answer, but your reasoning is wrong. So, wrong. I heard about some professor at some naval college, I think it was, some people training to go into like submarine warfare or whatever, submarine captaining and stuff. He'd have a good thing if, what do you write down? RAWR, R-A-W-R, R-A-W-R. He'd write down right answer, wrong reason, R-A-W-R. Right answer, wrong reason. We need to have not only the right answer, but for the right reason. It needs to be totally correct, not ostensibly correct. If we get something for the wrong reason, and then situations change, we can be in trouble. Especially if you're like deep under the ocean in a submarine. Need to be careful. So we got to know how to go through the steps and how to be true to the real world. That's what logic is about. We need to know what steps we got to go through, what things we need to know to get to the other thing, as you said with calculus, pre-cal, algebra 2, algebra 1. And so we learn, when we generalize from that what we see in solving equations in algebra or doing proofs in geometry, we can generalize and see, yeah, all human knowledge, human reasoning is like that, all conceptual knowledge, whether it's physics, fitness, politics, law, art, aesthetics, grammar, philosophy. We need to go step by step down to the evidence of the senses and identify something real. All the steps have to be correct also. There's method involved. And then we can apply that method we call logic. And we can apply that in forming generalizations. How do we form a generalization? When are they right? Because we can be right or wrong in generalizations. It's not merely, in some thought as we did at first. We can learn specific ways we can be right or wrong. Not just thought, as when we were like 3 or 5 or whatever, when we first learned what a lie is. Now we learn, an induction can be wrong. We can form a concept wrong. Our definition can be wrong. A classification can be wrong. What are the rules for doing these correctly? What are the techniques, the methods? There we're getting the concept of logic. Logic, is our means for making sure our concepts and thoughts are logically related to and derived from experience, from the evidence of the senses. So there we go. first experience, and then above that, learn our first words. Then we learn language and sentences. Then we learn people can be wrong, can make believe, can lie. Then we're learning something about logic. It's got to be a thought. It's got to be true to the world. But then we learn that there's more to thinking than we thought. Some ideas depend on others. We learn algebra and geometry. We learn method from that. You got to go through a sequence of steps, step by step, to reach a true conclusion. Then we can generalize from there to all thinking. All human reasoning requires technique and method. We got to go step by step from the given to reach a conclusion. And it traces back to the evidence of the senses. Then we're getting the concept of logic. And we can start to dig in, as I say, to what's the logic of a generalization? How do we know when we know that all lightning is electricity? How do we know that all planets orbit the sun in elliptical orbits with the sun at one focus? How do we know when we know that all humans are mortal? Are we right? Are we wrong? What is it to really grasp that induction? All humans are mortal. Then we're getting logical. How can we go through and put things together like a geometric proof that all humans are mortal? And notice here we can look at geometric proofs not as like deduction, as some people think they exclusively are. Not. They show how we can start from the evidence of the senses and reason from there. And that's what Aristotle did. So that's one thing I wanted to say about the concept of logic, where we get it. How we get it on our own. Now in history, Aristotle was the one that identified logic, figured it out, developed the theory. So what did Aristotle do? Well, one thing that helps to see is what Plato did versus what Aristotle did. Aristotle was a student of Plato. He was in Plato's academy for like 20 years. Plato was a genius, invented philosophy and its branches, identified it. There's been a lot of wisdom through history, but I'm not aware of anybody else around the world in history forming the concept of philosophy and getting its branches as Plato did. But of course, as I say, we've had wise people around the world, everywhere, in every culture for millennia. Now, it's an interesting thing at that time, like 400, 300 BCE, the only kind of more developed science, even though it was kind of compromised a little bit, was geometry. That's what they thought math was. And it's interesting that Plato and Aristotle both looked at geometry to learn about human reasoning, but drew very different conclusions. Plato, wrong. Aristotle, right. Plato. And remember, people were still learning things at this time. It wasn't until St. Augustine that we had the concept of mind, M-I-N-D, mind, the human mind. St. Augustine developed that concept. And it wasn't like, it was ancient Greeks like Plato and some people around him that identified explicitly the differences between concepts and percepts. That was very important. It was essential to really starting to figure out how to do science. So Plato was a genius. He did some things. He had asked some great questions. Most all his answers were wrong. But he did help with some things, as I say, like concepts versus percepts. So they were looking at that distinction, and people noticed that concepts or some thoughts were universal, whereas a percept was particular. You see one dog here and now. Some concepts were timeless, whereas a percept would be here and now. Concept universal, percept particular. Concept timeless, percept here and now. Concepts unchanging, percepts fleeting. Concepts permanent, percepts temporary. So there was this, like if we see a dog, or I could think, my cat is licking itself, licking its fur here and now. But that's very different than all cats lick themselves to groom themselves. So if I perceive my cat licking itself to groom itself, that's particular, here and now, fleeting, temporary. It'll never happen again. I do not have this perception again. But all cats lick themselves to groom themselves. That's universal. That's timeless. That's everywhere. That's unchanging, permanent identification. So the conceptual and the perceptual were different, and they identified those. Now, they were first learning how to do science. That's some of the questions the Greeks were struggling with. For example, with the concept and percept thing, then we get into the whole question of change, being and becoming. How do you reconcile those? Like the idea of Heraclitus about, supposedly you can never step into the same river twice. Things like that. Zeno's paradoxes. People are trying to figure out what the hell is going on. They're trying to figure out how concepts work, how reasoning works. They just didn't quite know that. They were focused on the world too much instead of their own thinking. They were looking in the wrong place. Just like the Pythagoreans. Pythagoreans thought math was everywhere. And of course, when you're thinking conceptually, it's everywhere because math is a tool of cognition. It's something we do. It's measurement. So it kind of reminds me of a joke I heard long ago, an Aggie joke. No offense, Texas Aggies. You can say it's like Longhorn joke if you want. But I heard it that way. So however you want to think about it. But an Aggie goes to a doctor and says, "Doctor, man, I hurt everywhere. Wherever I touch myself, it hurts. I touch my elbow. Oh, it hurts. I touch my knee. Oh, it hurts. I touch my ear. Oh, it hurts. Doctor, what's wrong? Why do I hurt everywhere?" And the doctor says, "Your finger's broken." That's how this is. It's not that math is in everything. It's in our means of knowing things. The Pythagoreans didn't get that, though. Too bad. But of course, I sure the hell never would have. I didn't even think of asking the questions when I was younger. They were genius enough to think about it, but they didn't know yet how to get the right answer. What is math? How do we use it? Where is it? What's the metaphysical status of math in number and things like that? Heck, some people to this day don't even get it right. And people had to figure out how to do science or induction. Aristotle was a genius at doing induction, but even he didn't figure out how induction worked, which is too bad. He formed some generalizations. He was awesome. He was a genius. He got a lot of stuff right. Like everybody else, he got stuff wrong. So do I, so do you, so does everybody. Big deal. But he got some fundamentals right. But Plato and Aristotle. So, in this context, they didn't get how induction worked right. All they knew was about induction by simple enumeration. Like, you look at all 100 things of a kind and all there are 100, and then you can form a generalization. That's the only thing they knew about. People didn't figure out how induction really worked until more like the 15 to 1700s, when scientists figured out how to do it in physics. Galileo, Kepler, Newton. They saw how experiment and induction worked. Really brought it to fruition. But people didn't know it back in ancient Greece yet. There were other fundamentals they had to get down first. Concept versus percept. Permanence and change. How do you reconcile them? So Plato was before Aristotle. He didn't have the advantage of having Aristotle's mind to learn from. But Plato is trying to explain, how can concepts be universal and timeless and percepts not? Like, you can't root universality in particular. Like, if concepts are timeless and this perception leaves, how can you get it? You can't step into the same river twice. It flows and never comes back. So, instead of grasping method and how consciousness works, he didn't know that, They only knew so much. Not everybody knows everything. We still have a lot to learn nowadays. We're wrong today on some things. But he tried to explain it by concepts and percepts being totally different worlds, unfortunately. And so, for example, he tried to think that we already knew stuff. You just had to be reminded. And so he had this, not knowing how to do science, just having a story to try to explain his point of view, not prove it, because he didn't know how to yet. He didn't prove what he did. He didn't know how to scientifically prove his points about logic and epistemology and philosophy. But, you got the story in Plato about Socrates teaching some boy some advanced idea in geometry by asking him questions. And supposedly that, this made-up story of Plato is supposed to show that, that's how knowledge works. But, of course, it's just like a made-up story. Just a bunch of leading questions. You ask anybody leading questions and you tell them what to say in your question, then, they can figure it out. Big deal. But, so what they're saying is kind of like Plato would say that concepts and reason is in us separate from reality. And he would actually say that because perception and experience flows and is particular and fleeting and temporary and here and now, it's full of illusion and delusion and lies. You cannot trust it for truth. So you got to turn away from it. There was all this disorder, irregularity, illusion, delusion, lies, and experience. You couldn't get truth there. I mean, imagine, would you want someone who's a neurologist to operate on you like that? I'd say, hell no. You go in, you interview him, someone you love needs an operation, and you talk to him, what's your philosophy? And he says, well, I'm a Platonist. The experience is full of illusions and delusions and lies, so I've never experimented because all I could learn is about a particular thing. Played with electric circuits? Hell no. When I was a kid, that's just experience and evidence of the senses and full of illusion and lies. I haven't played with stuff like that or done any dissections. Icky, gross. That's just experience. It's full of illusion. I've closed the blinds and closed my eyes and turned away from experience, and I've come up with the idea of a perfect nervous system and the perfect operation. This is what I'm going to do. Would you stay there? No. You'd run the hell out. Or walk politely. Say bye. That is not science. That is not logic. That is not reason. That is not truth. But that is Platonism. Then it comes up, you can look in history, see how it's a failure. Ptolemaic astronomy, failure, set science back thousands of years with the stupid circles and not having causation. Circles were perfect, and it's this perfect idea, and so we're going to use circles. There was no evidentiary reason. why to use circles. They did it for like simplicity and beauty, which is a bunch of nonsense. It doesn't work. The math was like cool and there were some like predictions, but it wasn't real science yet. They hadn't figured out how quite to do it. It was compromised. Kepler actually, when he did real astronomy, he actually called his work a new astronomy based on causes, because Ptolemaic stuff had circles rotating on circles without any object there. Like a planet would go in a circle, and that would go in a circle on a bigger circle. And you can look up Ptolemaic astronomy if you're unsure about that. Look up epicycles and stuff. You can get the idea. Maybe I'll post something in the show notes if I remember. You kind of see what nonsense it is. But there's no cause for what's happening. You have some circle, something like a planet would be rotating about nothingness. Or Ptolemy failed in refraction. He did the correct experiment to know the law of refraction, which Snell identified in like the 1600s. Snell's law of refraction, how light is bent in water as opposed to reflection. Like in water, if you try to grab where you think a fish is, you're going to miss it, even if it stays there, because the water bends going from water to air and vice versa. Or you can bend a ray of light with a prism. This is the refraction thing. So Ptolemy had the math. Trigonometry had already been invented by Hipparchus. So he could have done it, but he did not know how to take an experiment seriously and how to put ideas together, how to use the concretes in a context to get a correct generalization. So he failed to get the law of refraction. Snell had to do it much later. It took like Kepler was like kind of scientifically schizophrenic, part Platonic, part Aristotelian, but he had some weird stuff about like, simplicity, beauty. So, there's like 5 planets or whatever that they knew about at the time, and there's like 5 platonic solids. So, the orbits must be associated with a platonic solid. So how can I fit the platonic solids together and make them different sizes? So that's what it is. It's like BS. It's a bunch of nonsense. Airy-fairy, beauty, simplicity, nonsense. Doesn't work. Total failure. He couldn't get it to work. But when he looked at Tycho Brahe's data, Tycho Brahe, a observational astronomer who came before Kepler. Kepler was a theoretician, rigorous about being staying true to the data. Brahe just liked to observe things really well. He didn't have some good ideas about theory, but Kepler was strict about staying true to Tycho Brahe's data, the most accurate and precise at that point in history, more precise than any other. And Kepler saw that circles didn't work. They were off by a little bit. And so he knew there was something wrong. He helped people see how to form generalizations and use math to do science properly in a more Aristotelian fashion. He didn't dismiss the data as delusion and lies and illusion. We just got to see the underlying rational order that's there. We got to turn away from experience. No, he stayed strictly connected to it. Plato was wrong. So Plato, thought geometry proved that we don't need experience to reason. That's bogus. And he comes up with a little story about teaching the boys some geometry. That's supposed to illustrate it or prove it. and he would dismiss the evidence of the senses. So there we see how that idea that logic is just about connecting ideas is a total failure. It failed Kepler, it failed Ptolemy, it failed many scientists, it held science back. Aristotle got it right. In fact, and I'll put some proofs up, some like quotes, but I'm not sure how I pronounce this guy's name, but in the book Galileo Galilei, When the World Stood Still, by Atlenaeus, Atlenaess, he wrote, Galileo's radical renewal nevertheless sprang from the Aristotelian mindset. Right, Galileo engaged in a radical renewal of physics and science. Radical, at root, kicking out Platonism, putting in Aristotle, Aristotle's methods, keeping what Aristotle had right and improving on Aristotle. So Galileo's radical renewal sprang, nevertheless, from the Aristotelian mindset, as it was taught at the Jesuits' Collegio Romano, or however you pronounce it. Human reason has a basic ability to recognize and understand the objects registered by the senses. The objects are real. They have properties that can be perceived and then further processed according to logical rules. These logical concepts are also real, if not exactly in the same way as the physical objects. Unquote. And here, Galileo himself, when he's arguing against some of the scholastics of the time who blindly followed Aristotle without understanding Aristotle's epistemology. They just looked at what Aristotle said in a Platonic way. They did not get at root what Aristotle was about. He was arguing with them about the way the solar system worked. At the time, people thought, from way back, that things on Earth changed and things in the heavens didn't. Because you look up, the same stars. The stars are in the same place. They never grow or decay. There's not new ones or old ones or different color. They never change. Same place. Some planets, the wandering stars move around. But they got this repetition and pattern in their movement. So people thought, you look up, there's no evidence they had that things changed. Whereas on Earth, people come into being and die. All this stuff moves around. Things on Earth, in the heavens seem to go in circles and around the Earth. Stuff in the heavens was inalterable, did not change. Alterable on Earth. It could alter, it could change. Inalterable in the heavens. The moon, the sun, the stars. So Galileo was saying, hey, you're not right. But he said, and this is from the second letter of Galileo Galilei to Mark Welser on sunspots. It's page 118 from the book Discoveries and Opinions of Galileo, translated by Stillman Drake. Okay, so the book Discoveries and Opinions of Galileo is translated by Stillman Drake, stuff Galileo wrote. And this quote is from a letter he wrote, the second letter of Galileo to Mark Welser, and it's about sunspots, page 118. Copyright 1957. Okay, he says, Galileo, I should even think that in making the celestial material alterable, I contradict the doctrine of Aristotle much less than do those people who still want to keep the sky inalterable. For I am sure he never took its inalterability to be as certain as the fact that all human reasoning must be placed second to direct experience. So he got the Aristotelian method. Reasoning must be placed second to direct experience, the evidence of the senses. And there's nothing more certain than that. And given Aristotle's commitment to method, if he lived today, unlike Plato, Aristotle would see, oh, I see the evidence in how to put it together. Okay, you're right. Because I'm committed to the evidence of the senses, Aristotle would say, I see there is change in the heavens. We did not have the evidence in my time in like 320, 380 BC. We thought things in the heavens didn't change, but I see, yes, they do. Thank you, Galileo, for giving me the evidence and the reasoning as a geometric proof. Aristotle would be more like that because of his commitment to method. So we had to go through things like that to get rid of Plato, be more Aristotelian. Because Aristotle, when he looked at geometry, it's fascinating. Plato, Aristotle, they lived about the same time. They both looked at geometry to see and drew conclusions from it about how reason works. But Aristotle was right. Plato, wrong. Plato, geometry shows we don't need experience. Just turn away from it and do science. No, thank you. Aristotle showed, no. When we do a proof, he saw that you start with given stuff in a diagram and you go through certain steps to reach a conclusion. A lot of us do that, but none of us ever form the generalizations that he did. People get some stuff out of proof. Lincoln got a lot out of it, but he was after Aristotle's day, so kind of no wonder. But Aristotle looked at geometric proof and saw that there was a given, certain steps you go through, and with geometric proof and other things, some context, he generalized from that all human reasoning is based on the evidence of the senses, as kind of Galileo said. Because the given in a geometric proof was like experience. And then we could get concepts and reason, get concepts and inductions and thoughts after the given. And we can get, the given would be the evidence of the senses. We had to have experience and the evidence of the senses to form any concepts, and that's where it comes from. That's what Aristotle identified. That's where we get logic. So he's a father of science. He's a father of logic. Logic is about making sure our concepts and thoughts and theories are related to the evidence of the senses rigorously and logically. So there's another thing that shows, really gives us a good grasp of what logic really is, how we get the concept, what's the root, what does it mean? And here's some other quotes. So here's from an article, Aristotle, by Dr. Michael Fowler, a physicist at the University of Virginia who teaches from a historical perspective. Very good. At the end of his article, he says, to summarize, Aristotle's philosophy laid out an approach to the investigation of all natural phenomena to determine form by detailed, systematic work, and thus arrive at final causes. And this stuff about final causes and form, that's like some technical concepts of Aristotle I'm not going to get into. But to continue the quote, his logical method of argument gave a framework for putting knowledge together and for deducing new results. He created what amounted to a fully fledged professional scientific enterprise on a scale comparable to a modern university science department. It must be admitted that some of his work, unfortunately some of the physics, was not up to his usual high standards. He evidently found falling stones a lot less interesting than living creatures. Yet the sheer scale of his enterprise, unmatched in antiquity and for centuries to come, gave an authority to all his writings. It is perhaps worth reiterating the difference between Plato and Aristotle, who agreed with each other that the world is a product of rational design, that the philosopher investigates the form and the universal, and that the only true knowledge is that which is irrefutable. The essential difference between them was that Plato felt mathematical reasoning could arrive at truth with little outside help, but Plato believed detailed empirical investigations of nature were essential if progress was to be made in understanding the natural world. Truth. Okay. And more evidence. Aristotle was right. Plato was wrong. Newton, in his Rules of Reasoning and Science, 4 rules. Rule 1, admit no more causes than are both true and sufficient to explain the evidence of the senses, what we see. Don't make up a bunch of stuff and stories. Number 2, therefore, to the same natural effects, we must assign the same cause. Number 3, the qualities of bodies, which admit neither intensification nor remission of degrees, and which are found to belong to all bodies within the reach of our experiments, are to be esteemed the universal qualities of all bodies whatsoever. So, a little bit about generalization and universals. But number 4, in experimental philosophy, and by philosophy he meant, physics, experimenting. Philosophy at the time more meant everything, all knowledge. In experimental philosophy, we are to look upon propositions inferred by general induction from phenomena as accurately or very nearly true, notwithstanding any contrary hypothesis that may be imagined. Okay? So on this, he's saying, by hypothesis, he doesn't mean what we mean today. I think he meant just some idea someone makes up without evidence. There's no basis for it. Basically, it's arbitrary or improbable. So he's saying, even if someone makes up some airy-fairy story, some contrary hypothesis, they make something up in their imagination, they do not get it experimentally. They're not rooted in experience. They're not immersed in the evidence of the senses, immersed in a field. If they just make something up, dismiss it. It doesn't matter. What matters is propositions inferred, or we can say what matters is inducing from concretes. That's what he's saying he did. That's how he's saying physics works. By induction from concrete things. Not making stuff up in our heads. And in regard to Aristotle, to let you know how good he was, some people like to dog him about some of his physics, but I don't think he cared about it so much. He was reporting what other people believed. If you're going to dog Aristotle about it, then you're going to dog all the ancients about it, because a lot of them believed it. It's like, get over it. He was more interested in biology and philosophy. People nowadays have some beliefs that are ludicrous too, yet they want to give Aristotle a hard time. They need to look in the mirror. Everyone makes mistakes, especially those who misjudge Aristotle. Now, so here's some things about Aristotle. Charles Darwin's famous 1882 letter, in which he remarked that his 2 gods, Linnaeus and Cuvier, were mere schoolboys to old Aristotle, has been thought to be only an extravagantly worded gesture of politeness. However, a close examination of this and other Darwin letters, and of references to Aristotle in Darwin's earlier work, shows that the famous letter was written several weeks after a first polite letter of thanks, and was carefully formulated and literally meant. Indeed, it reflected an authentic and substantial increase in Darwin's already high respect for Aristotle, as certain documents show. It may also have reflected some real insight on Darwin's part into the teleological aspect of Aristotle's thought, more insight than Ogle himself had achieved, as a portion of their correspondence reveals. That was written by the great Aristotelian scholar Alan Gotthelf. And I'll put a link to as much of this stuff in the show notes as I can. Okay, here. In someone's writing about Aristotle and his zoology, Martin Shuttleworth. I'm not sure who the person is, but Martin Shuttleworth writes, Aristotle's zoology earns him the title of the father of biology because of his systematic approach to classification and his use of physiology to uncover relationships between animals. He influenced Theophrastus, and whilst other Greeks and later Roman philosophers contributed, these three can lay claim to being at the starting point of the history of biology. Martin also said, Aristotle's zoology and the classification of species was his greatest contribution to the history of biology. The first known attempt to classify animals into groups according to their behavior and, most importantly, by the similarities and differences between their physiologies. Using observation and dissection, he categorized species. Although his broad classification seems strange to modern zoologists, considering the limited equipment and store of knowledge he had access to, Aristotle's zoology stands as a tribute to his systematic methods and his empirical approach to acquiring knowledge. And here's from an article on the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, IEP, Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, from an article, Aristotle's Biology. I think this might be James Lennox who wrote this. I'm not sure, but I think so. He's another great, world-renowned Aristotelian scholar. What is most important in Aristotle's accomplishments is his combination of keen observations with a critical scientific method that employs his systematic categories to solve problems in biology and then link these to other issues in human life. Okay. And here's from an article in The Guardian about a book, The Lagoon, by Armand Marie Leroy. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. So if I butchered it, I apologize. But from the article, excerpt 1, the Greeks are famous, perhaps notorious, for casting their science whole from first principles without troubling to examine the natural world it sought to explain. But Aristotle changed everything, providing lengthy accounts of fish and fowl, their lives, courtships, kinds, anatomies, functions, distribution, and habits. They were often erroneous, but what sets Aristotle apart is his workmanlike attitude. One gets the impression of a practical man given to neither the remote and crystalline idealism of his predecessors nor the flights of fancy of later natural historians such as Pliny the Elder. Quote 2 from The Guardian. Darwin knew almost nothing of Aristotle until 1882 when William Ogle, physician and classicist, sent him a copy of The Parts of Animals he just translated. So The Parts of Animals is a book Aristotle wrote. Now, back to the quote. In his notes of thanks, Darwin wrote, from quotations which I had seen, I had a high notion of Aristotle's merits, but I had not the most remote notion of what a wonderful man he was. Linnaeus and Cuvier have been my two gods, though in very different ways, but they were mere schoolboys to old Aristotle. Okay, so there's not just me running my mouth about Aristotle. There's plenty of evidence for you to dig into on your own. Dr. Michael Fowler, Atlee Ness, or however you pronounce his name, Galileo himself, Newton himself, Charles Darwin, Aristotelian scholars, people who've studied his biology. There is plenty to show you the importance of Aristotle and his legitimacy, how he's the father of science and the father of logic, not Plato. You know, you look at some people who follow Platonic methods through history or today, failures. People who do well are Aristotelian. They immerse themselves in experience. Or to continue and to contrast the example of the neurologist with Plato, you know, if you wouldn't want someone like that to operate, but if you went in, you know, you'd want an Aristotelian. You'd want someone who's immersed himself in neurology, in electrical circuits, in dissections, in animals, and brain function, and nervous system function. who isn't dismissed experience or the evidence of the senses, but who immerses themselves in it, and as Newton says, he looks at that as they do in experimental philosophy. We are to look upon propositions inferred from general induction from phenomena. That's what you want someone to do. Classify, form concepts, define, induce from experience. So there's a difference. Plato versus Aristotle. Logic does not come from Plato. He is a failure. He did not get it. He did not get what logic could possibly be about. When we look at how we form the concept on our own, how Aristotle got it in the first place, then we can see where logic is in our thinking, where the concept comes from, how we use it, what it's for. Logic is our means of making sure our concepts and propositions are logically related to and derived from experience, from the evidence of the senses. We want to be real, and we need to follow certain methods. Methods of concept formation, defining terms correctly, forming generalizations correctly, things like that. That is what logic is about. Not about simplicity and beauty and nonsense like that with Ptolemaic circles, or Kepler trying to do the Platonic solids to explain the planets in the solar system, but applying logic. And then we can get into talking about some other things. So you can dig into how to form a concept, what a concept is, what induction is, the importance of definition. But we really need to get straight on what logic is in the first place. Why we need it, where it comes from, what's going on. See what's right and what's wrong in our culture, what to avoid. Got to be in the right place to use it for it to make any sense. So logic comes up in everything we do. No matter where we turn our minds to look, if we're thinking conceptually, we got to be logical. Whether it's fitness, philosophy, physics, math, music, art, astronomy, health, diet, anthropology, law, politics, whatever. To be real, to be successful, to do it right, we need logic. A proper concept of it. Logic is a set of techniques for defining concepts correctly, forming concepts correctly, generalizing about things correctly, reasoning, arguing correctly. So that's what logic is. And so this should be used to inform education and inform science and inform business good decision thinking. This should be used to structure how education is looked at and how it is practiced, the theory and the practice. Science, how science is thought of, the theory and the practice. Teaching should be done to relate concepts to reality, generalizations to reality, thinking to reality, to develop logic, because as humans, we must engage in reasoning. We have no choice. It's our nature. The only thing is, are we going to do it right or are we going to do it wrong? Are we going to help ourselves and our children, friends and family and culture, or are we not? So we should bring this into teacher training, let them know what logic is and how to better use it. That is a fundamental reform of education that we need. Again, it's not obvious. I sure the hell didn't figure this out on my own, or could not have, not possible. Not many people could. And even then, as I say, even Aristotle got some things wrong. did not quite know what induction was, we need to look at what we've learned through human history and use those concepts about epistemology and metaphysics and logic to inform education, make it better. We want what's best for our children and our future and our family and our friends and our culture. And this is the way we do it. Martin Luther King Jr. pointed out that there was a lot of mistakes at the time, people not presenting the truth. And education should be about teaching people to sift the facts from the fiction, assess evidence, reason correctly. So that's where this will really come into play. Teach some teachers in teacher training, basics of logic, what logic is, how we get it like this, as I just went over, rules of concept formation, rules of definition, rules of induction. And you don't got to do it so much explicitly, especially when the kids are young, but it should be implicit in how they're taught and how curriculum is structured, how things are sequenced. Then, when it's logical, it'll be a lot easier to understand. People will have evidence. They'll be rooted in reality. They won't just memorize a bunch of words. It'll be much more rigorous than it is now. Much more fun, much more interesting. It'll make sense to students. Oh, this is why it's important. Oh, this is how you explain it. Logic is valuable in many different ways. It makes us real. It's a tool of survival. It is therefore a tool of achieving values. Logic is, if you love something, you got to know what it is, how to take care of it. That's logic. Logic is a means of being true to reality, to what we care about, what we value, and to knowing how to better take care of it and nurture it. So that's what we need to do. Please, let's get more logic in our own thinking, in our friends and family, in the culture, in teaching, in education, especially in those, because teaching and education are at the crux of getting this done right and spreading it. It's about making the children better, making them optimal human beings. Let them be the best human animal they can be. So, if anybody needs any help in it, teacher training, I can help. Train schools, consult, institute a program, help with curriculum. I would be glad to. I would love it. I would love to see this much better. So, hopefully that helped. If you have any questions, you can shoot me an email or send me something. Then I'll put some of this stuff in the show notes so you can dig into some of it yourself. Know that I'm not making it up. Look it up on your own. Learn on your own. Verify. Cross-check. Cross-examine. Reason. Think. Get more examples on your own. Find out more than what I've said, because of course there's a whole heck of a lot more than just what we covered in this hour and a half. But cool. So, hope you found that valuable, fruitful. We need more of this in the culture. Yeah, if you'd like, pass it on. Teachers need this. Scientists need this. Politicians, a lot of people. Everyone who thinks would benefit from this, especially thought leaders, teachers, professors. Valuable, critical stuff. So, listen to the podcast, listen to it a few times, look into things, share the podcast with people. If you want to support the podcast, that would help. Contribute a little bit. So, hope you enjoyed this, as I say, and hope you have a good day and everything, and I will talk to you all soon.